Hello again. In this section we're going to look at keyboard shortcuts. If you're not interested in keyboard shortcuts and you don't use them, then you pretty much can skip this section, because we won't be adding anything in terms of functionality to building websites. We'll just be looking at ways of making it easier for you or somebody who works for or with you to use Dreamweaver. Now, before we move on to looking at the keyboard shortcuts in Dreamweaver CS6, I'd just like to mention one thing. Even if you don't particularly like or use keyboard shortcuts yourself, many people do prefer to use them. In some cases they really have to use them. Some people doing particularly repetitive tasks sometimes find that it's quicker to do them with keyboard shortcuts than using a pointing device such as a mouse. And for other people with certain types of disability, or where there are some kinds of accessibility issue, the use of a keyboard is probably the best or maybe the only physical action that they can use to interact with a computer. So it's a good idea to be aware of how keyboard shortcuts work, even if you don't know what they all are. And in particular, it's worth knowing how you can actually adapt the list of keyboard shortcuts in Dreamweaver CS6. And that's what we're going to look at quite briefly in this section. Now, first of all, we've already seen a couple of keyboard shortcuts. On the File menu, New has a keyboard shortcut of Control-N. That means that to bring up the New Document dialog, you can either use this menu option, or you can press the Control and N key together. If you're not used to this, you hold the Control key down, click the N, then release them both, and that's the equivalent of clicking on New. Now you'll see that several of the commands here have shortcuts, but quite a few of them don't. I personally don't really use keyboard shortcuts very much. That's a bit of a confession, I know, but the main reason that I don't is not that I don't intrinsically like them, but I use an awful lot of different pieces of software in a typical working day, probably at least 8 to 10 packages on a regular basis, and although some of the keyboard shortcuts are common, so I'm pointing at Save there, virtually every package I use, Save is Control and S. There are many where it's just impossible to remember and to differentiate between different keyboard shortcuts for different packages, and that's something that hits a lot of people really. They'd use them but they just can't remember so many. Control S is a common one. Another common one, let's just flick back to the help system here, F1 to bring up help. That's a common one as well, shared between most Adobe products and most Microsoft products, for example. There are several options on the menus here, if I just hover over some of them, where there are and there aren't keyboard shortcuts. But the good news is that in Dreamweaver you can actually adapt the list and you can provide keyboard shortcuts for commands that don't already have them. So let's look at some of the things you can do with keyboard shortcuts. If you click on the Edit menu, right near the bottom there's an entry, Keyboard Shortcuts. That brings up the Keyboard Shortcuts dialog, and basically what we have here is a drop down at the top that we use to select the current set of keyboard shortcuts. Now by default we get the Dreamweaver standard set, and if I click on Dreamweaver standard set, which was already selected, then the corresponding menu commands are listed. So let's say we've got the File menu commands. If I click on one of the commands, it tells me what the current keyboard shortcut is. Now, as you can see, the new Control-N, we saw that earlier on, new fluid grid layout does not have a keyboard shortcut. Now, if I wanted to, I could change these around, I could add them, I could remove them. Let's have a quick look at that now. Now the first thing to point out is that it's not a good idea to change the Dreamweaver standard set of shortcuts. So the best approach here is to make a copy of it and then change the copy, and then you can use that copy while you're using Dreamweaver yourself. Now there's a set of buttons up on the right here, and the first one of those says duplicate set. So I'm going to duplicate this set, and I'm going to call it Dreamweaver Toby as my set, and I'm going to make sure it's selected as the current set. Now let's say that I want to change that very first command, the one that's new, Control N. I would like that to do new fluid grid layout instead of new. So select new, which is selected. The minus button here will remove that keyboard shortcut. So click minus, that is no longer in use. Click new is fluid grid layout. Now I'm going to add a shortcut to that, so I click on add, press the keys, and then all I need to do is to say OK, and that shortcut is now assigned to the new fluid grid layout command. If I now go to the file menu, notice how it's represented on the file menu differently now. New fluid grid layout, if I click on Control N, I bring up that different dialog, the one associated with the new fluid grid that we're going to look at later on. So let's just go back into the keyboard shortcuts dialog again. You can see there how we can change the list. Obviously we can use the change button here to change a particular keyboard shortcut. There are a couple of other options on here that are important. The one which says export set as HTML is very useful, and what this does is it gives me a printable version of my keyboard shortcut list, which is handy to sort of stick over your desk to remind you of what the shortcuts are. If I click on that there, I choose a location for it. I'm not going to put it into my website, I might just put it on my desktop there, and I'll call it Toby KB shortcuts.html. Click on save. Let's take a look at that. And there I've opened that HTML in Microsoft Word. Scroll down there, well, you can certainly see the new keyboard shortcut, but if you scroll down there you'll see all of the keyboard shortcuts are shown on that one nice long HTML file. So I'm not going to dwell on keyboard shortcuts any longer than that, but I am going to do what I'm going to do from time to time, which is to remind you, with many of these dialogues there is a help button that takes you straight into the relevant page of Dreamweaver Help. And this one is a great example because there's a whole load of topics here about help, and you can see we've got creating a reference sheet, which we just did, and then how to create a keyboard shortcut, how to remove one, how to add a shortcut to a command, and so on. So a full list of the topics that you're likely to need in relation to keyboard shortcuts. Now, as I said earlier on, with many of these topics I'm going to refer you to the Dreamweaver Help. That's really got everything you need to know in it, and I think we've probably just about spent enough time on this, except for one last small point. And that last small point is that if I've got a particular keyboard shortcut set like this, Dreamweaver Toby, the last command button over here enables me to delete it. So if I click on delete set, it says which set do you want to delete. It points out to me that this is the active set. So before I do that, I ought to really put it back to Dreamweaver standard. Now if I click the delete button again, Dreamweaver Toby is no longer the active set, so I'm pretty much safe to delete that. Click on OK, and of course everything's back to the way it was. So that gives you a good idea of how to use keyboard shortcuts and how to modify them, set them up to suit your own requirements. In the next section we're going to move on to another very important general topic, and that's the topic of preferences. So I'll see you for that.